You were taught to be thankful for crumbs. You were trained to bow your head for the mere permission to exist. From childhood, society whispered a lie into your ears that survival itself is a gift granted by those above you, that endurance is virtue and obedience is dignity. But I tell you plainly, this gratitude was never meant to honor you. It was designed to tame you. Look around and ask yourselves, why must the majority struggle endlessly just to live, while the minority lives effortlessly from the labor of others? Why is exhaustion universal, yet abundance hoarded? Why are workers praised for resilience but denied power? These are not accidents of history. They are the logical outcomes of a system built on exploitation, a system that survives only by convincing the oppressed that suffering is natural and inequality inevitable. Capitalism does not merely organize production, it organizes consciousness. It teaches the worker to see wages as generosity rather than stolen value returned in fragments. It teaches hunger to call itself motivation and insecurity to call itself freedom. The laborer produces wealth beyond measure, yet owns nothing but the capacity to labor again tomorrow. This is not a moral failure of individuals, it is a structural theft embedded in the very relations of production. You sell your labor not because it fulfills you, but because you are denied access to the means of life. The factory, the land, the machines, the institutions, these are owned by a class that does not labor, yet commands the fruits of all labor. Thus society is split not by talent or effort, but by class. Those who must work to live, and those who live because others work. This division is the foundation upon which all modern misery stands. And to preserve this arrangement, the ruling class demands your gratitude. Be grateful for employment, even when it breaks your body. Be grateful for wages, even when they cannot sustain life. Be grateful for charity, even when it disguises injustice. Gratitude becomes a chain when it is demanded by those who profit from your deprivation. A person who is grateful for survival will never demand life in its fullness, but history does not move by gratitude. It moves by contradiction. Every system that exploits creates the force that will undo it. Every worker who feels alienated from their labor, every community fractured by competition, every human reduced to a tool of profit, these are not signs of capitalism's strength, but of its decay. The system requires your isolation, for unity would reveal your power. It requires your exhaustion, for clarity would expose its fraud. It requires your silence, for speech would become organization. Understand this. The working class is not powerless. It is rendered powerless. The same hands that build cities can halt them. The same minds that create value can redesign society. The same collective labor that enriches a few can, once organized, liberate the many. When workers recognize themselves not as individuals competing for survival, but as a class bound by common interests, the illusion collapses. You were never meant to beg for dignity, you produce it. You were never meant to thank your oppressors, you outnumber them. You were never meant to survive quietly. You were meant to live consciously. The task before you is not moral persuasion, but material transformation. Not isolated rebellion, but collective organization. Not charity, but justice. The old world will not dissolve through patience. It will fall when those who sustain it withdraw their consent and their labor, when solidarity replaces submission, when class consciousness replaces fear. Let the ruling class tremble at the awakening of those they have long kept silent. For once the exploited understand that survival was never the goal, freedom was the foundations of the system will crack. You were never meant to be grateful for survival. You were meant to claim life, power, and the future together. Under capitalism, survival is never simply a neutral condition. It is a tool, a weapon, a carefully constructed illusion designed to maintain the dominance of the ruling class. The worker is taught from the beginning that to live, one must submit, endure and adapt. The system presents life itself as a favor granted by those who already control the means of existence, conditioning the oppressed to accept scarcity as natural, injustice as inevitable, and exploitation as the normal state of affairs. Every wage, every paycheck, every token of subsistence is framed as a reward for compliance rather than the rightful return of labor. and this framing is not accidental. It is a central mechanism of control, a psychological strategy as vital to capitalism as the factories, offices, and markets through which surplus value is extracted. When survival is perceived as a privilege, the oppressed internalize limitations, believing that their suffering is deserved or unavoidable, and in doing so, they are less likely to question the structures that produce it. The laborer is made dependent not only on the employer, but on the narrative of benevolence that the employer provides. If survival is a gift, then rebellion becomes ingratitude, and discontent is painted as moral failing rather than a rational response to systemic exploitation. This ideological construction ensures that resistance is delayed, weakened, or misdirected. The worker may complain, may grumble, may negotiate minor concessions, but the fundamental structures of inequality remain unquestioned, because the very capacity to imagine an alternative life is constrained by the fear of losing what little has been allowed. Hunger, illness, and economic precarity are normalized, framed as inevitable hardships of life, rather than the deliberate outcomes of social organization. The working class is compelled to see endurance as virtue, patience as morality, and conformity as survival strategy, and in doing so, the energy that could be devoted to transformation is instead absorbed by the struggle to merely exist. The ideology of survival as privilege also produces competition among workers, a psychological fragmentation that undermines solidarity. If each person is conditioned to see the other's arrival for scarce resources, the collective power of the class is dispersed and weakened. Rather than recognize the structural roots of scarcity, individuals internalize blame, believing that their failure to thrive is a result of personal inadequacy rather than systemic exploitation. Capitalism thrives on this isolation, for a divided and grateful workforce cannot unite to challenge those who extract and accumulate wealth. Survival then functions as both carrot and chain. It is presented as a reward to be earned, while simultaneously binding the worker to the system that perpetuates deprivation. Those who rise above the baseline of subsistence are praised as exceptional, creating an illusion that mobility within the system is possible and that oppression is merely a problem of effort or skill rather than design. Meanwhile, the vast majority remain tethered to precarity, their energies sapped by the constant labor of survival, their awareness of collective potential stifled by the ideology that encourages gratitude for mere existence. The system manipulates fear expertly, the fear of hunger, eviction, illness, and social marginalization ensures that survival itself becomes a tool of submission. To question the structures of power is to risk losing the lifeline that the ruling class has framed as generosity, and this risk inhibits the imagination and the action necessary for resistance. Moreover, survival as privilege obscures the fact that labor produces wealth far beyond what is returned to the worker. Every hour spent in toil generates profit, innovation, and abundance for the few, while the majority receives only the minimum required to continue laboring. Gratitude for survival masks this theft, making exploitation appear acceptable or inevitable. It creates a psychological hierarchy that mirrors economic hierarchy, ensuring that even those who are aware of injustice are restrained by the perceived necessity of compliance. Capitalism's brilliance, if it can be called that, is not in creating wealth, but in convincing the majority to be thankful for what is stolen from them. The moment the oppressed stop viewing survival as a privilege and recognize it as a condition enforced by oppression, the dynamic shifts. The fear that once bound them dissolves, replaced by clarity and indignation. Awareness of exploitation fosters the possibility of solidarity. Consciousness of structural theft inspires collective action, and the recognition that survival is not a gift, but a minimum requirement of life becomes a stepping stone toward demanding justice. Survival is thus the battleground of ideology, shaping not only what people endure, but what they are willing to imagine, to demand, and ultimately to seize. Exploitation under capitalism is not a matter of individual malice or personal wrongdoing. It is embedded in the very structure of society, in the relationships that govern production, ownership and distribution of wealth. To perceive exploitation as merely the result of a few greedy individuals is to misunderstand the fundamental mechanics of a system that depends on inequality to survive. At the heart of capitalism lies the division between those who own the means of production and those who do not, between the few who control resources, factories, land, and capital, and the many whose labor creates value, but who are denied access to the wealth they produce. This division is not an accident, it is the defining principle of the social order. The employer, the capitalist, the shareholder is not exploitative in a personal sense any more than a law is unjust by itself. It is the system that defines their power and structures their interaction with labor. Workers are compelled to sell their labor in exchange for wages because they have no alternative means of sustaining themselves. In doing so, they generate surplus value that is appropriated by the owners of capital, a value far exceeding what is necessary to sustain the worker's life. This surplus is the source of profit, the foundation of wealth accumulation, and the engine of social inequality. Exploitation is thus systemic. It requires a structural imbalance in access to productive resources, a legal and economic framework that legitimizes the transfer of value from labor to capital, and social norms that reinforce obedience and acceptance. Individuals within the ruling class are empowered not merely by personal cunning, but by the institutionalized dominance of property relations, financial instruments, and legal authority. They benefit from exploitation, whether or not they consciously intend to oppress, because the system rewards the extraction of labor and punishes attempts to disrupt it. Similarly, workers are not simply victims of bad bosses, they are participants in a structural arrangement that limits autonomy and perpetuates dependency. Exploitation is therefore relational, defined by class. It is a product of who owns and who must labor, of who commands and who must obey, of who decides and who follows. This relationship produces social hierarchies, unequal access to resources, and the concentration of political and economic power. Attempts to address exploitation on an individual basis through appeals to morality, corporate responsibility, or isolated acts of generosity cannot resolve the systemic inequality because the structures themselves remain intact. The very organization of society ensures that the extraction of value from labor to capital continues unimpeded regardless of the intentions of those involved. Understanding exploitation as structural also clarifies why social inequalities persist across generations. The inheritance of wealth, property, and access to education reproduces class divisions, ensuring that the few continue to control productive resources while the majority remain dependent on selling their labor. Even when new opportunities appear, the system absorbs and redirects them in ways that reinforce the existing hierarchy. Structural exploitation shapes not only economic life but social consciousness. Workers are taught to internalize the limitations imposed by class, to see scarcity and precarity as personal failures rather than systemic design. Ideologies that valorize individual effort, meritocracy, and personal responsibility obscure the relational nature of exploitation, making the oppressed complicit in accepting and perpetuating their own subjugation. This is why class consciousness is revolutionary. When the working class recognizes that their oppression is not accidental or moral but systemic and relational, they see themselves not as isolated actors competing for survival, but as a collective force capable of challenging the structures that dominate them. Exploitation is reproduced in every workplace, every market, and every legal code that defines ownership and labor relations. It manifests in unequal wages, precarious employment, lack of access to health care, housing and education, and the social stigmas attached to poverty. Yet these manifestations are symptoms of the underlying class structure, not the cause. The capitalist system cannot exist without the continuous extraction of surplus labor from those who lack access to the means of production. This extraction is legitimized by law, enforced by institutions, and justified by ideology, which together naturalize inequality as inevitable. Structural exploitation is therefore self-perpetuating, yet it is not immutable. Its roots in class relations mean that it can be challenged only by altering those relations, by redistributing access to productive resources, reorganizing labor in ways that return the value of work to workers, and dismantling the legal, economic, and ideological frameworks that uphold domination. Recognizing exploitation as structural rather than individual illuminates the path to collective action, showing that resistance is not merely an ethical choice but a material necessity. That liberation requires transforming society itself rather than appealing to the conscience of those who benefit from inequality, and that class relations are the key battleground upon which justice, equity, and human dignity must be fought. Under capitalism, gratitude is weaponized. It is not merely a personal virtue or a spontaneous feeling, it is a carefully cultivated psychological mechanism designed to maintain social hierarchy and suppress dissent. From the earliest moments of life, individuals are taught to be thankful for what they are allowed to possess, what they are permitted to do, and even for mere survival itself. This lesson is repeated in countless ways, through education that glorifies obedience, through media that celebrates wealth as merit rather than theft, and through labor practices that frame wages and benefits as generosity rather than the rightful return of labor. Gratitude becomes a chain, invisible yet unbreakable, binding the oppressed to a system that exploits their labor and limits their freedom. By conditioning the working class to be thankful for crumbs, society convinces them to accept exploitation as normal, inequality as natural, and obedience as virtuous. When a worker feels gratitude for the ability to earn a wage, they internalize the idea that the terms of labor are inherently just, even when those terms are designed to maximize profit for the few at the expense of the many. The small reliefs provided by charity, minimum wages, or token benefits serve not to empower but to placate, to remind the oppressed that their survival depends on the goodwill of those who profit from their toil. This manufactured gratitude obscures the structural theft of value that defines capitalism, ensuring that workers do not see themselves as producers of wealth entitled to autonomy and fairness, but as recipients of favors to be appreciated. The more a person believes they owe their existence, security, or comfort to their employer or the system, the less likely they are to challenge exploitation or demand systemic change. Gratitude, then, operates as ideology. It shapes perception, molds consciousness, and reinforces the hierarchy of power. It is both the mask and the lubricant of oppression, making inequity appear benevolent and domination appear consensual. Social rituals of thanks, whether in the workplace, the educational system, or civic life, reinforce this mechanism. Employees are encouraged to praise their leaders for opportunities, students are taught to thank authorities for instruction, and citizens are instructed to admire the generosity of those in power, all while the structural conditions that necessitate these acts of thanks remain unchanged. Through gratitude, the oppressed are trained to accept that their labor, time, and creativity are properly compensated by survival alone, when in reality they are producing wealth far beyond what they receive. This psychological conditioning has profound effects on social behavior. It promotes passivity, discourages collective action, and fragments potential solidarity. Individuals who see survival or minimal recompense as a gift are less likely to unite with others to demand justice, less likely to recognize shared exploitation, and less likely to resist policies and practices that perpetuate inequality. Gratitude also functions to moralize inequality. When one is taught to be thankful for what they have, suffering is reframed as a necessary part of life. Poverty is a test of character, and compliance as virtue. The working class internalizes blame for conditions created by the system, imagining that their failure to thrive is due to personal shortcomings rather than structural. Exploitation. The ruling class benefits enormously from this internalized gratitude because it turns oppression into consent, coercion into obligation, and theft into charity. When gratitude is demanded, it becomes obedience in disguise. Workers who are taught to thank their employers for employment, even when the employment is exploitative, effectively legitimize the very system that confines them. They provide ideological reinforcement to those who extract surplus value, ensuring that resistance is delayed and that the mechanisms of control remain intact. The socialization of gratitude extends beyond the workplace into culture, politics, and education, where narratives of meritocracy, personal responsibility, and opportunity serve to obscure systemic inequality. Individuals are encouraged to believe that survival and small gains are the result of effort and luck, not the exploitation of collective labor. By framing dependence as privilege, the system secures compliance, inhibits class consciousness, and prevents the recognition that collective action could alter the conditions of existence. The moment workers or oppressed groups begin to see survival not as a gift but as a basic right, not as a favor but as a minimum requirement of justice, the ideological grip of gratitude begins to weaken. Recognition of this manipulation opens the possibility for solidarity, organization, and revolt. Gratitude, once seen clearly as a tool of domination, becomes a lens through which the systemic nature of oppression is revealed, clarifying that freedom and equality are not rewards to be begged for, but rights to be claimed through collective struggle and conscious transformation of society. Workers' unity and class consciousness are not abstract ideals. They are the very foundation of revolutionary power, the engine through which the oppressed can confront and overturn the structures that exploit them. Power under capitalism is concentrated in the hands of those who own it, control the means of production, and it is maintained through the division, isolation, and alienation of the working class. Individually, workers appear powerless because they are made to compete for survival, to see one another as rivals rather than comrades, and to accept scarcity and inequality as natural conditions. The system thrives on this fragmentation, on the belief that no single worker and no collection of isolated workers can challenge the authority of the ruling class. Yet the reality is that the very same labor that produces wealth, sustains society, and drives the economy also carries within it the potential for collective liberation. The moment workers recognize their shared conditions, their common exploitation, and their collective interests, they begin to awaken to the power they have always possessed but have been trained to ignore. Class consciousness transforms perception. It reveals that oppression is not personal, accidental, or the result of individual failures, but systemic, structural, and imposed upon the working class by the ownership of capital. When workers develop this awareness, they see that their struggles are interconnected, that individual suffering is part of a larger social pattern, and that their collective efforts can reshape the conditions of life. Unity is the expression of this consciousness. It is the practical application of understanding that one worker cannot thrive in isolation while others are oppressed. Solidarity allows workers to coordinate their demands, defend one another, and challenge authority with the force of numbers. Strikes, protests, mutual aid, and organized labor are manifestations of this unity, demonstrating that collective action amplifies the power of each individual. Without unity, grievances remain isolated and ineffective, easily suppressed by those who control wealth and institutions. But when class consciousness merges with organization, the working class becomes a decisive force capable of disrupting production, challenging political authority, and reclaiming the value of their labor. History is replete with examples of the latent power of workers that emerges when they recognize themselves as a class. Revolutions, labor movements, and social reforms have all been born from the recognition that collective struggle is the only way to resist systemic exploitation. Capitalism relies not only on economic control but also on ideological manipulation, including the internalization of competition, individualism, and gratitude for survival. Unity and class consciousness counteract this manipulation by building networks of awareness and resistance, teaching workers to see their shared interests, to understand the structures that oppress them, and to act in concert to alter those structures. This power is not theoretical, it is material, rooted in the very labor that sustains society. Factories, offices, farms and service industries depend on the uninterrupted work of the many, and this dependency reveals the vulnerability of the ruling class. If workers organize collectively, they can withhold labor, disrupt supply chains, and demand changes that align with their needs rather than the profits of the few. Class consciousness and unity thus transform the social position of workers from passive participants in exploitation to active agents of change. Moreover, the cultivation of solidarity nurtures resilience, persistence, and strategy. Workers who understand their collective power are less likely to be divided by superficial differences, less likely to accept palliative measures that leave the system intact, and more likely to pursue comprehensive solutions that address the root causes of inequality. Education, dialogue, and shared struggle reinforce this consciousness, building a culture in which exploitation is identified, challenged, and ultimately dismantled. The recognition that power resides not in the institutions of capital but in the collective labor of society is liberating. It shifts the perspective from one of submission to one of possibility, from passivity to action, and from fear to courage. Class consciousness also enables workers to challenge not only economic oppression but political domination. When united, they can influence legislation, demand equitable distribution of resources, and transform social relations to prioritize human need over profit. The potential for change is limited only by the capacity of the working class to recognize itself as a cohesive, organized force. True liberation is impossible without this dual understanding, that exploitation is systemic and that the power to alter it resides in the collective strength of labor. Workers' unity amplifies their agency, and class consciousness illuminates the path toward emancipation, showing that the survival, dignity, and flourishing of the majority depend not on the benevolence of the few, but on the conscious, organized action of the many. Collective organization is not an optional strategy within capitalist society. It is the essential condition for dismantling the structures that perpetuate exploitation and oppression. Capitalism is sustained through the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few, a system in which the labor of the majority produces resources, goods, and social value. Yet the benefits are appropriated by those who own the means of production. This structural inequality is maintained not only by economic arrangements but by ideological manipulation, legal frameworks, and social institutions that normalize submission and competition. The individual worker, isolated, exhausted, or fearful, has little capacity to challenge this system. The illusion of powerlessness is deliberate, reinforced by cultural narratives that valorize personal success while obscuring systemic theft. Collective organization, therefore, is the countermeasure to this manufactured impotence. When workers, the oppressed, and marginalized communities organize, they create networks of strength that amplify their individual capacities, transforming vulnerability into power. Organization provides the tools to resist, to negotiate, and ultimately to restructure society. It allows the working class to coordinate actions that disrupt the accumulation of surplus value, challenge the authority of the ruling class, and assert control over the conditions of production. Strikes, unions, cooperatives, political movements, and community alliances are all expressions of collective organization that translate shared grievances into tangible power. The effectiveness of such organization lies not only in numbers but in consciousness. For collective action to challenge capitalism successfully, it must be grounded in an understanding of systemic exploitation, the mechanisms of control, and the interdependence of labor. Without this awareness, organization risks being co-opted, diluted, or reduced to symbolic gestures that leave structures of domination intact. But when rooted in clarity, solidarity, and purpose, organization becomes revolutionary. It converts dispersed discontent into strategic pressure, channels energy from frustration into coordinated action, and transforms scattered resistance into sustained campaigns for systemic change. Capitalism's resilience depends on the fragmentation of the oppressed, the isolation of labor, and the internalization of competition. Collective organization directly counters this fragmentation by building networks of mutual support, communication, and shared purpose. It allows workers to recognize their common interests, to see themselves as part of a class that can act collectively, and to challenge the narratives that encourage submission and gratitude for minimal sustenance. Moreover, collective organization enables the oppressed to reclaim the value of their labor. When labor is unified and organized, the extraction of surplus value can be resisted, whether through direct action, negotiation, or systemic reform. The power of the many, properly coordinated, exceeds the capacity of the few to enforce domination, revealing the dependency of the ruling class on the labor they seek to exploit. This recognition is crucial, for it underscores that capitalism is not invincible. Its strength lies not in moral superiority or inevitability, but in the complacency, disunity, and fear of the majority. Organization transforms that dynamic, converting latent potential into realized influence. Furthermore, collective organization serves to protect and empower those who are most vulnerable within society. Marginalized groups who face compounded exploitation due to race, gender, or other social hierarchies find strength and visibility through coordinated struggle. Solidarity ensures that no individual or group bears the full weight of systemic oppression alone, creating a culture of shared defense, strategic cooperation, and inclusive participation. This is the foundation for dismantling capitalism not merely as an economic system, but as a social order sustained by ideology and coercion. Historical movements demonstrate the transformative potential of organization. Revolutions, labor movements, and sustained campaigns for rights and justice have all relied on the disciplined, strategic and conscious coordination of the oppressed. When the working class and allied communities organize collectively, they disrupt the routines of capitalist accumulation, expose the contradictions of the system, and make visible the power that resides in those who produce society's wealth. Organization is not only a means of resistance, but a prefiguration of the society to be built. In organizing collectively, the oppressed practice solidarity, shared decision-making, and equitable distribution, demonstrating that alternatives to hierarchical, profit-driven control are not theoretical abstractions but practical possibilities. Collective organization, therefore, is both defensive and transformative. It defends against exploitation and domination in the present, while creating the conditions for a society structured around justice, equality, and human need rather than profit. It is the mechanism through which awareness becomes action, discontent becomes strategy, and latent power becomes realized influence. Capitalism cannot be dismantled by isolated efforts, moral appeals, or passive hope. It requires the concerted, disciplined, and sustained mobilization of those it exploits. Organization is the bridge between oppression and liberation, the vehicle through which systemic structures can be challenged, and the force through which a society premised on equality and shared human dignity can be constructed. The struggle I have laid bare is not abstract, it is immediate, tangible, and unavoidable. Survival under capitalism is not a blessing to be grateful for, it is a tool wielded to suppress your power. Exploitation is not the result of bad individuals, but of a system structured to extract your labor while enriching the few. Gratitude has been weaponized to normalize inequality and enforce obedience, teaching you to accept subjugation as virtue. Yet within you lies the source of real power, the unity of workers, and the awakening of class consciousness. When the oppressed recognize themselves as a collective force, they reclaim the capacity to resist, to demand, and to transform. And it is only through collective organization, through solidarity, strategy, and coordinated action that the foundations of capitalist domination can be challenged and dismantled. The chains imposed upon you are neither natural nor inevitable. They exist to be broken. You were never meant to be grateful for survival. You were meant to rise, to organize, and to claim the life, dignity, and freedom that is rightfully yours.